I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. 2020 has proven so far to be a terribly challenging year. As everyone is well aware, a pandemic, a lot of economic pain and disruption for many, a necessary nationwide movement demanding justice, equality, and opportunity for all, and all in the midst of a fairly wild political season in what certainly feels like, to me, to be the most consequential election of my lifetime. So amidst all this activity and tumult, thank you for joining us for the discussion tonight. Salmon are a Northwest icon, species of great cultural, ecological, and spiritual significance. And it is my great privilege this evening to spend the evening with and introduce LeeAnne Beres of Earth Ministry and the Reverend John Rosenberg to explore the sacredness of salmon and how the faith community is bringing people together in the Pacific Northwest to restore the lower Snake River and its salmon for the benefit of all. LeeAnne and I go back, I don't know, more than 20 years. We've been working together and palling around for that long, and it's been a wonder. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight with us, LeeAnne. LeeAnne joined Earth Ministry in 2005, providing strategic direction that led to the development of the organization's nationally recognized faithful advocacy program, launching Washington Interfaith Power Light, and revitalization of the Greening Congregations program. Previously, she served as the associate director, my boss, at one point of the Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition. She was the outreach director of the Northwest Energy Coalition and has held numerous organizing positions in other environmental nonprofits. She survived 2 years working as a biologist on commercial fishing boats in Alaska's Bering Sea. And she served on numerous national, regional, local boards and is active in her church, the Fauntleroy United Church of Christ in Seattle. LeeAnne has a master's degree in Marine Fisheries Management from the University of Washington and a bachelor's degree in biology from Whitman College in Walla Walla. I think LeeAnne's going to kick things off. But before she does, I just want to say a few things about John Rosenberg as well. I've known John, 10 or more years. We've worked together on and off on salmon restoration projects of all different kinds, presentations, time together in front of policymakers in Olympia and other projects. And it's a real pleasure, John, to have you here tonight. John is a retired Lutheran pastor and an avid and quite skilled angler, an environmental advocate. In addition to his theological training, he has a master's in Pacific Northwest history from Portland State University, where he did research on the history of salmon declines in the Columbia and Snake Rivers. His articles on salmon and salmon recovery have appeared in a number of publications, including High Country News, the Center for Environmental Law and Policy, Newsletter, the Seattle Times, the Olympian, and Earth Letter, which is the newsletter of Earth Ministry back in spring of 2019. He's a former board member of Earth Ministry and currently serves on the board of the Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group and the Regional Fisheries Coalition. He and his spouse, Nancy, live in Tumwater, Washington. LeeAnne and John, thank you so much for being here tonight, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Joseph. I really appreciate being here today, and I'm glad to be with all of you out there in Zoom land. Before we start though, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Seattle, Washington, which is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Duwamish people, the Duwamish tribe, the first people of Seattle. And I think it's important, especially given our subject matter tonight, to just take a moment to honor the land itself and the Duwamish people, past and present. And as Joseph said, I love this issue, and I've been working on Snake River salmon recovery for over 25 years now. I am a very fishy person, as you heard. Started out as a fisheries biologist on board commercial fishing boats, Also love to fly fish. I'm a life member in Trout Unlimited and have spent most of my career working on salmon and offshore fisheries issues in and around the Washington State and Alaska area. So this is an issue that I personally very much care about and am very excited to share some of that passion and energy with you this evening. Tonight, I'm speaking to you specifically in the context of my role at Earth Ministry, which is a faith-based organization that transforms faith into action for the well-being of communities and the environment. We mobilize and inspire and engage people of faith to engage in advocacy at the state, local, national, and regional levels. And we provide strategic guidance to faith communities that are looking to engage in environmental justice. And in our presentation tonight, John and I are both going to be talking about how the faith community is bringing sacred and secular values together as we build community and work for justice for both salmon and orcas, as well as our neighbors and our common home. But because this is a new issue for some of you, I'm going to share my screen and just do a little bit of background and introduce you to Snake River salmon and why they are so important to the Northwest. Salmon are an incredible species. They have survived multiple ice ages and swim for thousands of miles in the Pacific Ocean, as well as going upstream hundreds of miles in their natal rivers to spawn. And this map just gives you a snapshot of their historical range, with the blue in the ocean being their ocean range and the green being the extent that salmon historically were able to swim upstream at their peak distribution. And as you can see, this is just an incredible diverse landscape all the way from Japan to Alaska to the Northwest. And speaking of the Northwest, salmon are an incredible icon here for us. As Joseph mentioned, they're a spiritual, cultural, economic, and ecological icon for all of us. And we're going to be talking specifically about the Columbia River tonight, the Columbia River and Snake River Basin, which is what this map is. And in this map, you can see the basin itself is outlined in light green. And the current range of Columbia and Snake River salmon is the dark green area, which is limited now by certain dams that were built without fish ladders or other passage. The author Timothy Egan wants to find the Northwest as wherever a salmon can get to. And that has historically been very true, but now unfortunately with more dams going in, that Northwest is shrinking a little bit. And as I said, John's going to talk more deeply about the sacredness of salmon, but salmon, water, and rivers have long played a major role in a diversity of religious traditions. In the Hebrew Bible, in Ezekiel 47, it states that wherever the river goes, every living creature will live, and there will be very many fish. If you prefer something a little more poetic, perhaps you like David James Duncan, a great writer from Lolo, Montana. And he says, there is a fire in water. There is an invisible flame hidden in water that creates not heat, but life. And in this bewildering age, no matter how dark or glib some humans try to make it, wild salmon still climb rivers and mountain ranges in absolute earnest, solely to make contact with that flame. Words can't reach deep or high enough to embody this wonder. Only wild salmon can embody it. Each migration, each annual return from the sea, these incomparable creatures climb our inland mountains and sacrifice their lives so that tiny silver offspring may be born of an impossible watery flame. I just love that reading. And salmon are also central to the cultural and life ways of Northwest Native nations. And salmon play a role in nearly every creation story in Northwest Native tribes. In the Salish tribes tradition, the people who were new to the world and had just come onto the earth had yet to find food and were starving. And each creature was represented as a tribe, and the chief of the salmon people offered her son to feed everyone else. Afterwards, the sacrificed child's bones were placed into the river, in the water at the mouth of the river, and the young salmon was resurrected. And this sacrifice is honored today in tribal first salmon ceremonies, in which the first salmon of the season that is caught, a piece of it is given to each member of the tribe, and they give thanks to the salmon for feeding the people. Then the salmon bones are gathered and placed back into the water and given thanks and resurrected again to feed the people the following year. A similar story is seen in other traditions, but a little twist is in the Nimipu, the Nez Perce tribe, in their creation story. Aitsitse, known as Coyote, was fishing at Celilo Falls on the Columbia River when he decided to save the earth from a monster that was devouring up everything in the world. Coyote lets himself be eaten by the monster and cuts his way out. And he flings the pieces of the monster around, which become the people that are scattered to each corner of the world, and they get their names and become the different tribes. And the important thing to note is that in every telling of the story, Coyote is out fishing at Celilo Falls when he hears about the monster. It's not a huge plot point, but it's just very telling that the creator of the world, Coyote, was simply out fishing on one of the largest and most sacred rivers to the people when the first humans were created. And for many tribes, it's the salmon itself that make the river sacred. The author Sherman Alexie writes that his mother no longer sees the Spokane River as sacred because the salmon are gone. And the real tragedy is the salmon are gone in far too many places. The Columbia and Snake River salmon basin, Columbia and Snake River basin was once most productive salmon producing streams in the world. There were between 10 and 16 million salmon that would come back every year. And as recently as 1950, there were nearly 130,000 salmon that came back to the Snake River alone. And within most of our lifetimes, however, these vibrant salmon runs have plummeted down to fewer than 10,000 fish, and all 4 salmon and steelhead species on the Snake River are now at risk of extinction. And so you may be wondering, what has caused this recent and devastating decline? And the answer is simple: construction of 4 dams on the lower Snake River between the Tri-Cities of Washington and Lewiston, Idaho. And you can see that on the inset in this map. The 4 dams, Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental, Little Goose, and Lower Monumental, were all constructed in the 1960s and 70s. And while there were other dams on the Columbia River that were built prior to then, it was the addition of these 4 dams that the cumulative impact of the impacts to the salmon runs, which have caused this drastic decline. And a lot of people think that adult salmon are the ones that have the trouble going through the dams, and they do have challenges. Adult salmon have to scale fish ladders and they have to find them, and sometimes they're steep and they're tired, and there are challenges for the adult fish returning back upstream, but it's primarily the juvenile salmon that have the trouble going downstream through the dams and the reservoirs. And I could give an hour-long lecture on that, but suffice to say that the salmon are adapted to be flushed downstream quickly in 2 to 3 weeks from the Rocky Mountains of Idaho out to the ocean. And they didn't have to used to expend very much energy. The salmon would just coast downstream, the young salmon, and they would make it to the ocean in plenty of time before they turn from a freshwater into a saltwater fish. But with the creation of these extra dams, now the reservoirs are long and slow, and the current is gone, and the juvenile fish have to turn around and swim, and there's predators. The water temperature gets hotter. There's more ability for them to succumb to disease and predation. And when they get to the dams themselves, they have a Faustian choice of either being forced to go through the turbines that are generating electricity at the dams, or be spilled over the spillway and can actually get nitrogen supersaturation, which gives them the bends. And so at each dam, in each reservoir, there is a significant mortality. And it was the addition of these 4 dams and the cumulative effect of all the dams on the system once these 4 were built that has truly been the straw that has broken the camel's back. And scientists have told us that for nearly 30 years that restoring this lower Snake River by removing these 4 dams may be the only way to restore endangered salmon and steelhead and the orcas that depend on them. The situation is urgent. There have been decades of delay by federal salmon agencies and a lack of political leadership in the region. And as with every passing year, these fish get closer to the brink of extinction. We know what we need to do. We have the facts and the science is clear. To save the salmon, we need to remember why they're holy, tap into our shared values of stewardship and justice, and find the political will to do the right thing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to talk about the spiritual and sacredness of the salmon and the orcas that depend on them. And then I'm going to come back after he speaks and share more at the end on how the faith community is bringing people together to find solutions that work for everyone in the Northwest. So John, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, LeeAnne. I'm speaking to you from Tumwater, which is the traditional home of the Stay-Chas people, which is one of 7 clans that today are part of the Squaxin Island tribe. So I just want to acknowledge that. And thanks for sharing what you did. Some of the material that I present will piggyback on that and hopefully not be too repetitive, but I'm going to share my screen as well. Let's see here. And I think I'm going to go away. So, but I'll come back. Willa Nelson is a biologist, a wonderful biologist, who was one of the co-authors of a 1991 study, Pacific Salmon at the Crossroads, which appeared in the Bulletin of the American Fisheries Society. And that particular study was a key component in the listing of some of the 28 salmon species that are now listed under the Endangered Species Act. And she also, about the same time, wrote an essay entitled, "Without Them, Who Are We?" She was referring to salmon, but she could have just as easily included orcas. And she concluded her essay with these words: "Salmon are part of us. They connect us to something greater than ourselves. In stretching ourselves to know them, we may know our context and ourselves better and create a better future." I love the way she said that. So let's see here. As LeeAnne said, salmon and orcas, of course, are sacred for indigenous people, not only in the Pacific Northwest, but Japan, Korea, the Russian Far East, the Kamchatka Peninsula. Not everybody knows, however, that in the past they were also sacred for many of our Celtic and Nordic and Germanic ancestors. So that's part of the tradition as well. Native people speak eloquently and often about how salmon and the watersheds that sustain them are at the heart of not only their physical, but also their spiritual lives. In fact, the distinction which we Westerners sometimes make between the spiritual and physical worlds would not make sense for many, if not most, indigenous people. Salmon and orcas are also sacred for non-native people. Even here in the secular Pacific Northwest, what Patricia Killen once called the none zone. Salmon and orcas connect us to what Marcus Borg once called the more, that is the sacred, the holy. Pacific Northwesterners could easily be characterized as religious when it comes to the natural world in general, and salmon and orcas specifically. Consider how, let's see, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Consider how salmon inhabit the public art and architecture of our region. They are embedded in our sidewalks. They light up our decks and Christmas trees. They are so ubiquitous that Tim Egan once observed that an anthropologist who is new to our region would find more fish icons than crucifixes. They are so much a part of our self-understanding that it is sometimes hard for us to remember that they are also going extinct. This picture is of a building in downtown Olympia that's affectionately known by locals as the Mistake by the Lake, and it's been extensively remodeled, but it's interesting. You can't see it, but in the background is the Capitol of Washington, the legislative building. But on the side, there's workmen here that are putting up the salmon icons on the side of the building, and they're really quite striking. Loretta Jankowski, who's the retired dean of the School of Theology and Ministry at Seattle U, summed it up for many in a wonderful title for an article she actually wrote in Earth Ministry, I think in 2011. And her title was, "I Believe in God and She is a Salmon." And that kind of says it, I think, for a lot of people. Most of you remember the fall of 2018, Taliqua, a mother orca from the J-pod, gave birth to and then lost her calf, but refused to give up her calf. Those who witnessed Taliqua's tragic cortege through the Salish Sea with her dead calf lasted 17 days. I think everybody who saw that had sort of an intuitive sense that something beyond words, something simply larger than a death of a creature was happening. The entire world responded to her grief. And the pictures of her and her calf reminded me of Michelangelo's famous Pieta, his sculpture of Mary holding her dead son Jesus, prominently displayed near the entrance of St. Peter's in Rome. So at least that's how I was thinking about it at the time. Southern resident orcas are starving, and scientists tell us that they're quickly headed for extinction because a significant part of their diet includes spring Chinook salmon, which are also headed for extinction from the Columbia and Snake River system. Citizens and their elected leaders in the Pacific Northwest will need to decide very soon if keeping the dams on the lower Snake is worth the cost, which includes the loss of both salmon and orcas. That's an ethical issue that speaks to our sense of justice and community. And even though breaching the dams could make economic sense, it goes beyond simple cost-benefit analysis to a question of what kind of community we want to live in and who's included in our definition of community. More voices than just the Bonneville Power Administration, the Corps of Engineers, and the Bureau of Reclamation need to be part of that discussion of who's in our community and how do we want to live. Will our definition of community include justice for the Nimipu, for whom salmon are not only sacred, but a keystone species that determines or defines at least their lifeway? The tribes were never consulted when the hydro system on the Columbian Snake was put into place. That's not simply an economic issue, it's a question of justice, which is a key component of every religious tradition, at least the ones that I'm aware of. Is there a place in our definition of community for what Aldo Leopold called a land ethic that expands the definition of community to include not only humans, but all other parts of the earth as well, soil, water, plants, and animals? Can we embrace a moral code of conduct that grows out of a sense of interconnected, caring relationships, not only for those who depend upon a healthy river, but for what many people call all my relations, including salmon and orcas? For Christian people, salmon provide us with a window into how creation happens. The first thing I learned attending parochial schools, which is where I got my education, was that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But I never really understood the evolutionary mechanics of creation until I started learning about salmon. My first encounter with them came while exploring a mountain stream in the Cascades as a young man. That first time I saw salmon was the closest I think I've ever come to having what some people call a spiritual experience. The same is true for other people who await the return of the salmon each year as part of their spiritual and religious practice. Salmon literally created the Pacific Northwest rainforest by bringing nutrients from the ocean into the barren, scoured out valleys that were left by the retreating glaciers 10,000 years ago, and providing the biological basis for those rainforests. And I love this picture of the wolf. I think it's even more than 137 species of fish and wildlife and plants that depend on Northwest salmon. They are a keystone species, as we say. The life cycle of salmon provides an analog, I think, for the Christian drama of redemption and resurrection. Northwest tribes had a story, LeeAnne related a version of that, about how the salmon people lived under the ocean, and each year they voluntarily transformed themselves into salmon and returned to the rivers of their birth. They sacrificed themselves so that people and creatures would not starve. Paul talks in a similar way, I think, in Philippians when he writes of how Christ, at least in one translation, set aside the privileges of deity and became human, living a selfless life and dying a selfless death, and laid down his life for his friends. Or in the language that we use in the liturgy, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Salmon build community. In traditional theology, building community is the work of the Spirit. John Hart, who was instrumental in helping to formulate the Catholic Bishops' Columbia River Pastoral Letter, described the intricate ecology of the Columbia Snake River watershed as a sacramental commons. And what he meant by that is that it's a physical, incarnational way in which we humans and all living beings experience the grace of God. It's like the water of baptism, like the bread and wine of Holy Communion. LeeAnne described that first salmon ceremony, which sounds very much like a Eucharist in many ways. Our native neighbors have known and celebrated this from time immemorial. We non-natives, I think, are only now beginning to learn it. Hopefully not too late. The sacredness of salmon is on display every November at the Kennedy Creek Salmon Trail in Mason County when the chum salmon return. It's a place where I serve as a volunteer docent. The creek itself comes out of the Black Hills. It's less than 10 miles long, and only about 5 miles of it is accessible to salmon because of a falls that they can't get past. Nevertheless, every year, every fall, November, almost like clockwork, 20 to 40,000 salmon, and some years as many as 80,000, return to crowd the creek, spawn and die, and provide rich nutrients for over 140 species who depend on them. And every November, volunteer docents guide 5,000 students from local school districts, along with their teachers and chaperones and other adults who come to the trail to witness the miracle of the returning salmon. As one elementary student said of the salmon, they bring the world with them. And LeeAnne showed you the map. The students might not say that the salmon are holy, but in a very deep sense, they experience it. And year after year, I hear about this from their teachers. The experience of seeing those salmon in Kennedy Creek really changes their lives in some good ways, I think, in some exciting ways. When salmon were first being listed under the ESA, former Seattle Mayor Paul Schell said something rather profound to Tim Egan, who was interviewing him for an article in the New York Times. He said, "As we work together to save the salmon, it may turn out that the salmon saves us." Salmon have been saving the lives of people and the other living members of our regional community for thousands of years. it's time for us, I think, to do the right thing and to reciprocate. So I'm going to send it back to LeeAnne. And
thank you,
stop.
John. That was great. Nice grounding in the spiritual aspect of salmon. And picking up where John left off, I think it's important to note that the faith community cares as much about people, our neighbors, as we do about the salmon. And we particularly honor and follow the leadership of Northwest Native tribes who are working for the benefit of all of our relations, which are the salmon, the orcas, and our human brothers and sisters. Earth Ministry is specifically working with the Nimipu, the Nez Perce tribe, and Lummi Nation, which is up by the Canadian border near Bellingham. We provide staffing for tribal events, educate people of faith on salmon and orca issues that are important to the tribes, and mobilize the faith community to speak out with elected officials on issues that affect salmon and rivers and tribes and the people of the Northwest. And I'm going to share my screen again to show you some pretty pictures about that. Pick up where we left back off. And this is just one example. Last fall, we were out in Lewiston, Idaho for the Nimipu River Rendezvous. It was it's an annual event hosted by the Nez Perce Nimipu Protecting Environment folks. And we hosted a pray and act table. This is one of our board members, an Episcopal priest who is just a rock star volunteer for us. And so she came out with us. And we had people use both sides of their brains in trying to connect with this issue. We offered folks the opportunity to write a prayer on a salmon and hung them on a tree in the middle of the park where the gathering was being held. You can actually see a portion of that tree in the inset photo. And it gave people a chance to pour their hearts out and to write what was on their hearts and minds and what they're praying for in terms of trying to restore the salmon and the orcas and keep our neighbors whole in the Northwest. And we also had an action component where we encouraged people to send a postcard to Senator Maria Cantwell asking for her leadership in making the investments and the transitions that we need to move to a free-flowing Snake River. We also work with the Lummi Nation. This is a couple photos from their totem pole journeys. They've been leading the way in calling for the restoration of orcas in the Salish Sea and understanding that we are indeed all relations above and below the water. These totem pole journeys, there have been 7 of them over the last 7 years, and Earth Ministry has helped host them in dozens of faith communities and congregations around the Northwest, and helping to bring thousands of people to hear directly from Lummi leaders on why this issue is so important to their culture and so important to their history and so important to them as a people. And just one such event was held at St. Mark's Episcopal Cathedral here in Seattle. And the bishop himself said that it was standing room only, and he called it a Christmas and Easter crowd combined, which is high praise from a bishop in a cathedral in Seattle. But that just shows part of the depth and breadth of the interest in the support that the public of the Northwest has in supporting Native nations and understanding the connection between rivers and orcas. And here's just a few more pictures that show bishops and equivalents standing in solidarity in faith communities, Christian, Jewish, Unitarian, other faith traditions around the Northwest, and really understanding that we as people of a faith have a history with Northwest Native nations. The church was one of the primary forces that uprooted Native children and sent them to boarding schools, and was trying to eradicate culture and language. And so we have a responsibility to right those wrongs. And the bishops of the Northwest actually sent a letter to the Northwest Native Nations acknowledging that history, making amends, and saying, we will stand with you in your fight to restore the salmon, to protect rivers, and to stop fossil fuel development, which affects native lands around the Northwest. Earth Ministry is also talking to our own community. Not only are we supporting the Native Nations, we are out in faith communities across the Northwest telling the stories of people who care about this issue and helping folks understand what's at stake. And so this is just an example of, you can see in the bulletin, we did a Snake River salmon presentation at First Congregational in Walla Walla last fall. This is in pre-pandemic times, obviously. And we've done dozens of these, you know, around Eastern Washington and even more over in Western Washington, having real conversations with people in the pews, if you will, about why this is an issue people of faith should be concerned. I've also had preaching and teaching in all kinds of faith communities as well. Since the pandemic has started, however, we've had to shift everything online, much like we're doing right now. And this was actually a Zoom webinar that we did, I think 2-3 weeks ago with Jacob Schmidt, who is one of our current board members. He's the one in the highlighted box there, river guide and salmon aficionado. And he also led a session specifically for Eastern Washington folks on the holiness of salmon. And so we had folks come from Spokane, Walla Walla, Tri-Cities, Wenatchee, all around Eastern Washington to understand why we as people of faith should care about these issues. And we are reaching out further than both tribal and faith communities to engage others with a stake in river restoration and salmon recovery. And this is the thing that I am most passionate about, because in addition to the tribes, 2 other constituencies rely on the resources of the Snake River and play a big role in the economy of the Northwest. Commercial fishermen deliver salmon to our tables that have swum thousands of miles through the ocean and hundreds of miles in the Columbia Basin. And wheat farmers in the Palouse grow grain that feed the world. And while there's sometimes competing issues amongst these different constituencies, the one thing that we all have in common are shared values, including a love for the Northwest, a respect for creation, and a desire for a better future for all people. And so faith leaders are playing an important role in reconciling differences and finding a path forward that meets everyone's needs while restoring the great gift of creation of the salmon. So what does that look like? We have been bringing together Native leaders, farmers, fishermen, and people of faith over the last several years to discuss the future of the Northwest. Our Loaves and Fishes events have provided a safe space for community members to share their hopes for the region and to be in conversation about potential challenges. Our goal is to see the region come up with a solution that meets the region's treaty obligations, help recover salmon and orcas, and invests in the important community transitions that are going to be needed if we remove the 4 lower Snake River dams. And so we've held 5 of these gatherings in Eastern Washington and Idaho communities, listening to the people who have a stake. We've heard from grain growers that want an affordable and reliable way to transport their crops by rail once the barges can no longer navigate a free-flowing river. We've heard from irrigators who want assurances that they'll still be able to get water from the Snake River once the levels have normalized to pre-dam levels. We've heard from local businesses that are excited about the possibilities for a revitalized sport fishing and river recreation economy. We've heard from commercial fishermen who want to be able to pass on their livelihood to their children, but who are afraid there might not be any fish left to catch. We've heard from faith leaders who understand that we have a moral obligation to restore salmon and keep communities whole. And then, of course, we've heard from Native leaders who are rightfully demanding that we respect tribal treaty rights and culture and return the salmon to their natal home. So all of these voices need to be heard. And the good news is that our elected officials are finally listening. And I want to give you two pieces of good news about that. Earlier this year, Washington's Governor Inslee created a statewide stakeholders process that brought together all of these different constituencies, including scientists and river users and environmental advocates and local communities, along with the farmers, the fishermen, and the tribes, to really listen and better understand each other's perspectives and to identify what people will actually need to be kept whole if the dams are removed. It started with an online survey last summer, and we helped engage people of faith in responding to that survey, especially our folks in Eastern Washington. And there were 3 listening sessions in Lewiston, Clarkston, in the Tri-Cities, and in Vancouver, Washington. And we had numerous faith leaders attend those sessions and speak out for restoring salmon and making sure our neighbors' needs are met. And actually, thank you, John, for being one of those folks that went and testified down in Vancouver. The exciting news this week is that that Washington state process that happened earlier this year in January is now morphing into a 4-state process with all the governors of the Northwest. This just came out earlier this week. It's very exciting. And the 4 Northwest governors are convening a broader stakeholder conversation. And how that's going to look is still unfolding. They're probably going to be working on the framework for that for the rest of the year, but it's going to be focused specifically on action, not just more dialogue, in figuring out how we can identify what the roadblocks are to salmon recovery and figuring out what needs to happen and how to get the money for and the political will for the investments we need to make to protect our Northwest communities. And once the governors do their thing, it's going to go to Congress. And so we've also been working, the faith community has been working very closely with key members of the Northwest delegation. This is Representative Derek Kilmer, who is the congressional representative for Washington's 6th district out on the Olympic Peninsula, all the way from Port Angeles and Port Townsend, all the way down to Tacoma and Gig Harbor on the south, which is a traditionally strong commercial fishing district. And so he and his constituents have a stake in this issue. And as one of the senior members of the Northwest, of the Washington delegation, he's been helping to broker some of these conversations. And so we sent him a letter back in August, signed by 76 religious leaders in his district, thanking him for his leadership and encouraging him to bring other members of the Washington delegation along. Because anything that comes out of the governor's process is going to need congressional approval, and more importantly, it's going to need funding. If we need to put in infrastructure and rebuild some of the rail lines along the river to move grain down the river from Eastern Washington, the Palouse area, out to the Tri-Cities. If we need to extend irrigators' pipes so they can pull water out of a lower river level, we're going to need money for that, and we're going to need congressional support. And so one thing you can do, and I really, really, really encourage you to do this right now. You can see the link down below at the bottom of the slide. And Carrie, maybe if you have a hot minute, you could type that out and put that into the chat for me, since I can't do that and screen share at the same time. We are sending a letter to Washington senators, Senator Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray, that asks them to step up and to also be leaders in the Northwest delegation. And this is a pivotal time. It's an exciting time. This is more action and movement on this issue than I've seen in the last 26 years that I've been working on it. And it's exciting because everyone's coming to the table. We've got folks that have been historic adversaries, or coming at the issue from different perspectives, that are sitting down and saying, how can we work together? What do you need? What do you need? And what we all need, like I said, is the support and leadership of our congressional delegation. So if you think of yourself of any kind of person of faith, you don't have to be a person who goes to a worship service every Sunday. If you are a spiritual person, if you are a personal faith, I hope you have some connection to in your heart and mind, because you're on this webinar. But we'd like you to sign this letter to Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray, asking them to step up. So that's the action item for tonight. And thank you, Carrie, if you've been able to share that link in the chat. And with that, like I said, I'm heartened right now. I think we're on a path to action. This is a time when real solutions are possible. And if we work together, we can get to a place where we can have restored salmon, we can have thriving orcas, we can have a burgeoning inland Northwest economy with grain and recreation and fly fishing, and communities that turn towards the river instead of away from it, with all the opportunities that river walks and other community development can bring. And so thank you, all of you who are on this call, for the passion you bring to this issue. The faith community is doing our part, and we're just excited to be on the same team and look forward to the next year and what the possibilities bring. And with that, I will turn it back to you, JB. Thanks.
Thank you, LeeAnne and John. As someone who is immersed in strategies and action alerts and policymakers and phone calls on a daily basis, I just have to tell you how much I appreciate the last 40 minutes, your presentations and perspectives. It's just such a good reminder, and it's frankly energizing. I think what we're going to do now is transition into Q&A. And as a reminder, I want to encourage, people can use the Q&A button at the bottom, or you can post questions on the chat. And I'll say a couple things and give folks a moment to do that. We already have some, but I just want to remind people that this webinar, the speaker series, is being recorded and will be made available on the SOS website. And Save Our Wild Salmon also has a YouTube channel. I think if you Google Save Our Wild Salmon YouTube, it should pop up pretty easily. The other 6 webinars that we've hosted this year are already up there, and this one will be up soon. With that, I'm going to start poking through some of these. I think, John, you mentioned you wanted to respond to Judith's question. Do you want to jump in? Do you want to jump in now with that?
Sure. Yeah, she had a great observation. I don't know. I mean, I think she was trying to make a point, but I just wanted to reinforce it. She talks about water and watershed, which, I just think is amazing. One of the things that's happening in a lot of congregations now is doing tribal land acknowledgements. And I wish personally that people would also do a watershed acknowledgement so that people could be aware of where their watershed is. In Thurston County, and this may be true in other counties too, but we pay a certain amount of money every time we pay our taxes for a stormwater utility to treat stormwater. And part of that money is used for something called the stream team. So there are stream team coordinators for Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and then for Thurston County. So there's 4 of them. And they're constantly doing educational things to make people aware of their watershed and what happens when the water goes down the drain. And they do things, everything from tree planting to, they do a nature or a salmon trail out at McLean Creek that people can come and see chum salmon in that watershed. So that's happening, and it could happen more. And God bless Judith for pointing it out. So thanks.
I'll just add, thanks, Judith, for that question. In the Snake River Basin, the main cause of decline for salmon and steelhead there really is, as LeeAnne described, the 4 lower Snake River dams that have blocked access to 5,500 river and stream miles of excellent salmon habitat upstream in central Idaho, northeast Oregon, and in southeast Washington state. But different basins have different problems, and I think the things that John was just talking about, and Judith, you're mentioning more locally, at least on the west side of Washington state, there's all sorts of different ways that people can get involved and that actions that need to be done. And I think that your point about education and helping people connect with their place they live in the waters and the watershed is really important. And John, I want you to make sure I know next time that probably next fall when the chum are running, because I want to come observe that. That sounded wonderful. Someone, an attendee named Ken, raised a question of I thought the feds just decided that dam removal wasn't going to happen. Do either of you want to take a stab at responding to that question?
Well, I know that you have a lot you'd like to say about that, Joseph, so I would be happy to let you chime in. But I think the bottom line is that's the same story we've been hearing from the federal government all along. We need to understand that this is now the 5th or 6th salmon plan that the federal government has come out with over the last 25 years with their plan to restore Snake River salmon, which has been everything except take out the dams. And those plans have failed over and over again. That's why they are being forced to come back again with yet another plan and another plan and another plan. And the science is clear that we need to take the dams out to bring these fish back. And the federal agencies are just lagging behind and are not living up to their call to be good stewards of the river and good stewards of the salmon. And so this is not the end of the story, because it wasn't the end of the story. The previous 5 or 6 times they've come out with a plan that was deemed inadequate. And so our job is to keep the pressure on and to bring people together to show that a different path is possible, and that many of the objections that has historically been put forward to not take out the dams are becoming moot, because if we can find ways to meet people's needs, a grain grower isn't wedded to having their grain go downstream by barge. They want it to get down quickly, easily, and reliably and cheaply, right? And so if we can find a way to do that via rail rather than barge, then they no longer care whether the dams are in place. And so that's the kind of creative thinking that we need to be focused on, that is not been part of the federal government's calculus so far. Does that, you feel free to chime in and redirect that a little bit, JB, if you want.
No, that was a great answer. I would add a couple things. What we've learned over the last 25 years is that the federal agencies in a federally led process, they're not capable of solving this problem. And we saw that once again in this summer and fall, when they produced and then finalized their sort of latest plan. That realization isn't just amongst advocates, but I think it's being understood more broadly by the people and leaders and sovereigns and stakeholders of the Pacific Northwest, that if we're going to solve this problem in a way that's going to work for us and meets those needs that I think LeeAnne highlighted earlier, salmon restoration, upholding our obligations to tribal nations, investing in healthy communities and clean and affordable and reliable energy. Those kinds of solutions are gonna have to emerge from our region. And I think that's what's exciting right now to me and many others, is that these connections that exist are being recognized and utilized. And there's a bunch of conversations going on in the region right now. Earth Ministry and LeeAnne and others in the faith community have been helpful in fostering these connections. There's other conversations going on with fishing people, with utilities, with farmers, to start new conversations about a new way forward that meets everyone's needs, moves everyone forward together. And so the feds have issued that their best take. They're not really equipped to resolve this, and that's where the region is stepping up, and the region's going to have to step up. And I think we've made a bunch of progress as a region, and we've got more hard work ahead to really take advantage of this opportunity and necessity, solve some problems, and create some opportunities for people moving forward. So it's an exciting time, and there's a bunch of hard work ahead. Thanks for raising that question, Ken. Colleen asked a question about one federal legislator told her that hatchery fish are basically the same, and there's not much of a difference with wild salmon, and is looking for some advice on effective responses or some talking points. Do either of you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. That's a hot topic. As Joseph and LeeAnne both know, if you've got a little time to do some research, one of the things that I'd recommend is looking at a book by Jim Likotowicz called Salmon Without Rivers, which talks about the whole debate about hatchery and wild fish. I mean, I think the reality is that we need them both. We need wild fish, and taking out or breaching, I guess, would be the thing we're doing with those 4 lower snake dams, would provide some wonderful spawning habitat and open up some wonderful spawning habitat for wild salmon. But I think most people would agree that there's no way we can meet our treaty obligations, for example, to native tribes, without some use of hatcheries, and the question is how we use them. And the devil is always in the details, but they are different, I think I would say, and to describe the difference would probably take longer than we have.
One of the things I'll add, I generally agree with John. Certainly in the near term, in order to help uphold our obligations to not only native tribes, but also fishing people who were told last century when dams and other habitat impacts and destruction was occurring, don't worry, we got you covered. We're just going to install some hatcheries and you'll be kept whole. What's happened over time is that promise has been unfulfilled, and hatcheries by itself are not an adequate answer. They don't serve ecological needs, and they rely on a bunch of human intervention. And ultimately, those hatchery fish are based on wild genetics and wild fish. And so, in the near term, I think hatcheries are part of the equation, but we've got to, over time, increase our faith in nature, if you will, and our reliance and the opportunity for wild self-sustaining populations to survive, to thrive, to restore themselves. And that's, I mean, restoring rivers is one aspect of reconnecting and restoring resilient habitats that the fish know what to do with, if we give it to them.
They've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into Anita's question of whether the Elwha Dam has been an unqualified success. And I think it's an incredible success story. That river was blocked off for nearly 100 years. It was long time, and the salmon are coming back. They have come roaring back, and the silt flushed out. The habitat has been, the river normalized. The habitat is along the riparian areas has regrown and restabilized, and the salmon have returned. So it is an example of how the community came together, decided that those dams needed to go. The federal government made it happen and found some of the funding to make that work. And it's a win-win situation for both the community and for the fish.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there may be a story coming out soon in the Seattle Times that provides the latest sort of view of the status on the Elwha River restoration, and it's more than just fish that are restoring. It's that whole river system, the coastline. There's been all sorts of sort of amazing ripples and connections as a result of that river restoration, including. I've seen presentations, this is a few years ago, but, songbird populations have expanded in the basin now, and they're having 2 clutches. They're having young twice in the summer because there's more resources, fish eggs and other things for them to eat. Otter populations have returned, and they're, and expanded. So it's really an ecological restoration, far beyond just the river or salmon. And I think it's continuing, and it's going to continue. And of course, it's really important to recognize there was a strong justice element in that restoration project. It was that restoring that river had been sought by the Elwha, Lower Elwha tribe for decades and decades. And I think in that regard, restoring that river righted some historic wrongs. And there's obviously other work to do in that regard. I think in the Northwest, there's a bunch of river restoration projects that have occurred, 2 this summer on the Pilchuck and the Nooksack rivers. And while we don't have fish coming back there yet, in every other instance I can think of, on the white salmon, for example, or the sandy, we restore the river restores itself quite a bit more quickly than we expect. And the fish take advantage of it almost immediately. So, there's a lot of real world data available now, because we've been at this for a little while, and I haven't seen a river restoration fail yet. LeeAnne, I want to make sure you got an email address from I think Mueller Book Club on the chat, and that person is looking for the poem, maybe from David James Duncan, but if you can just make sure you have that email address, and you can follow up with her, I think it's her, with Pam, maybe, and connect on that. Let's see. Can you talk a bit about economics of taking the Snake River dams out? A question from Mark Fleischer. We can. Do either of you want to say anything on that?
Well, you're the one who just hosted a webinar with a leading economist to talk about those issues, Joseph. So I would be fine.
I wanted to give you the chance, LeeAnne.
I appreciate that. I want to take the faith-based question at the end. So
why don't you buy me a little time and go ahead and answer that. We'll come back to the economics.
Great. So there's a question in the Q&A. It doesn't have a name attached to it, but it says, I too am a faith-based individual, know that God created this beautiful place we call home and was created for all species, not just humans. I'm angry at the arrogance humans have shown to all God's creations to satisfy human greed. How can this be discussed in a friendly manner so that we can all come together and repair the damage we have caused? Salmon, orca, and all species have run out of time. And I think that's where the faith community really has a role to play. We are a unique voice and a unique constituency. And what I think brings us together is, and I mentioned this at the beginning, are our shared values, right? You can get to a place of agreement with nearly anyone if you can find shared values. And we found shared values talking with the plant manager of the Centralia coal plant years ago that actually broke the conversation wide open and ended up working to find a way to transition that plant to closure while supporting the workers that work there. So if that is possible, anything is possible. and just really understanding that we all care about leaving a better future for our children. And people might start from a different perspective. Like, a fisherman might say, I want to be able to pass on my livelihood to my child. A farmer might be like, I want to pass my livelihood on to my child. Those might seem to be disparate things if you're talking about what does that look like. But you start from that place. And if you can have that heart-to-heart conversation with folks and to sit down and have a cup of coffee, changing people's hearts and minds and understanding that we want the same things can be very powerful. And where the faith community comes in is we can provide the safe space for those conversations to happen. We've been having one-on-ones with people across the Northwest. Like I said, we've been hosting these loaves and fishes events that provide a safe place for people to come in and share what's on their heart in a way that is vulnerable and is really moving and has brought up some real emotion at times. And hearing that and listening to really understand as opposed to respond is a great way to start. And that's something that each of us can practice in our own conversations with friends and neighbors and people who we might not agree with, to really hear what's driving it. Is it fear? Is it anxiousness? Is it a love? Is it, what is underneath what they're saying? And I like to think about the faith community bringing hope, right? And hope isn't a blind optimism, right? It's not just pretending that everything's fine and it's going to be all okay. Hope is grounded in courage and it's grounded in action, because it's understanding that we know that there's going to be a better world. We just have to roll up our sleeves and work for it. And that is part of what calls us to do this work, and to help other people see that is a way to invite them into the conversation in a way that can be really powerful.
Thanks, LeeAnne. John?
Yeah, just to say, I think that's one of the key important points of this stakeholder conversation that's getting broader and broader with more and more people in it. That decision or the EIS, I guess, from that just came out, in the spring, was written by Bonneville Power Administration folks, and Bureau of Reclamation folks, and Corps of Engineer folks. And the questions that are on the table involve the whole region and all of the people and creatures in the region. And so, with all due respect to Bonneville and the Bureau of Reclamation and the Corps of Engineers, they should not be the only ones to decide, what kind of a community we're going to have and who gets to be included in it. So I think the fact that political folks are starting to step in and say, wait a minute, first of all, you guys haven't done very well on this. And secondly, more people need to be involved in this discussion, is part of it. And, those conversations are going to be hard. And sometimes it's hard to put your anger aside, but I think you have to play the long game and keep your eye on the prize. So anyway.
I want to, maybe I'll speak to Mark, your question. Can you talk a little bit about economics of taking the Snake River dams out? I'll say a couple things. One is that we did do a webinar in June with a gentleman named Adam Demansky, who authored an economic analysis of, do we keep the dams in? What are the economic consequences or cost benefit analysis of keeping the dams in or removing them and replacing their services? And so that's available on the SOS website right now, and I think on our Save Our Wild Salmon YouTube channel. Adam's very articulate. He did an excellent job, and it was a really great webinar. That's one thing. I think to talk a little bit about what Adam would tell you is that there are costs and benefits to restoring the river. His analysis showed that it makes economic sense to restore the river, to remove those dams and restore the services they provide, in what will result is sort of a net gain for society in terms of jobs, in terms of economic opportunity. And I think he would acknowledge that his analysis was conservative. It undercounted the benefits of a restored river and restored salmon. One of the things that he found, for example, is, there's a considerable amount of money that goes into supporting the current set of the current dams and the barging operations that are associated with it. And those things, some of the things that are sort of most controversial and toughest as a region for us to talk about are the ones that are most easily and most affordably transitioned from, say, barging to rail. And that there's, when you look at it from a strictly economic standpoint, that it's a pretty strong case that restoring the Lower Snake River leads to far greater benefits for society than the status quo. The last thing I'll say is, you could reach out to me or Carrie, joseph@wildsalmon.org. Would be happy to share with you some links or chat on the phone and talk further about this, because we've got a bit of information, but not enough time this evening. So thanks for that question. There was another question that came up. Katie Kirk asked about the purpose that the 4 dams were built on the Lower Snake in the first instance. LeeAnne or John, do you want to take an initial stab at that?
Well, like a lot of Western water projects, they were heavily promoted by regional boosters who wanted Lewiston, Idaho to be connected to the ocean. And I mean, it's a bigger answer than that, but and I think the main thing for the people in the region, or one of the main reasons, was they wanted to be able to ship grain and not have to rely only on the railroads. And so this idea of making the Snake navigable all the way from Astoria up to Lewiston, Idaho, which is 400 some miles inland, was something that, people really wanted. They were actually put in the 70s, some of them in the 60s, I think. But yeah, and there's locks on them. You can take a boat from as I did once, from Portland all the way up to Lewiston, and you go through, 8 locks. And they're used for shipping, although not as much as I think people imagined they would be, and not as much for grain as I think people imagined they would be. But that was, I think, the main reason was that there's some irrigation, obviously, and there's also electricity. Although one of the things about the economics of the whole thing is that the energy market is changing so rapidly because of renewable energy is coming on with wind and solar and that kind of thing, that it's not going to pencil out for Bonneville to keep those dams at a certain point. Many economists point out. So anyway.
Thanks, John. That segues into a question that from Jean who's heard from the power and energy agencies that without the dams there wouldn't be enough energy. And so, taking a step back, the dams today provide, I think, 3 main services: energy production, the barge transportation, which was the original purpose that for which they were conceived, and then there is irrigation that's drawn from the lowest of the 4 reservoirs behind Ice Harbor Dam. That water that's drawn today, I'll just say quickly as an aside, was drawn from a free-flowing river and could be again if and when the dams are removed. But there would need to be some investments in upgrading the pumps and lengthening the pipes and that sort of thing. And there is work underway to understand those details and make sure that we're as informed as advocates as we can be about what that kind of transition would look like and what would be involved in making it happen and supporting it. But on the energy side, I think, John, you sort of alluded to the fact that the suggestion that the energy can't be replaced, or that there would be blackouts in the event the lower Snake River dams were removed, is just not true. And it's been, I think, sort of a bit of fear mongering that's been going on for decades. There's a few things that are in play here. One is, as John said, the energy sector is very dynamic. Renewable power resources, solar and wind, for example, have their costs of investment or production have plummeted in the last 5 or 10 years. And frankly, it's opened up this conversation in really helpful ways, because the dams do provide some energy. That energy value has been declining in recent years. And if the dams are going to be removed, we're going to have to make sure the services, the electrical services they provide, which are modest but replaceable, are in fact replaced. And so we can't try to solve some problems and create new ones. And that's really what this conversation in the region is all about, is making sure that we're developing comprehensive solutions that can move everyone forward together. The Save Our Wild Salmon, for example, with some other nonprofit organizations, advocacy organizations, are right now in conversation with a set of utilities that have been willing to get together and talk about how we might be able to find ways forward that meet the utility needs and meet the needs of salmon. This is one of those connections that's being made today amongst many that I think is really promising. It's people who are connected, who haven't been talking, and who need to work together in order to move forward together. And you know, I think the conservation community is ready to carry water for the utility community in a transition, as long as the reciprocal is also true. And that's what we're exploring. We've made progress. We've got more work to do. But there are clearly energy solutions available. Northwest Energy Coalition, who's involved in that conversation too, released a great report in 2018 that's also on the Save Our Wild Salmon website under our fact sheets and reports page, or you can go to northwestenergy.org, and they talk about how what an energy service replacement could look like, what it would cost. It's feasible and it's very affordable. Less than what their analysis found 2 years ago, and it's lower now because the renewable cost of renewables have gone down, is about $1.25 per household per month for the region. That would be the cost of this transition to replace the energy services Lower Snake River Dam. So, there's more work to do there, but we've got enough information to know that solutions are within reach.
And I had dropped that link in the chat for us, Joseph. So anybody who wants a link to the Energy Coalition's energy study, you can follow that link.
So we're about 7:20, and I'm just looking over a couple of the questions. You know, John or LeeAnne, you should feel free to grab a question or jump in if you're so inclined.
Trying to see what's left here. Nancy had asked a question about the 4 governors who are collaborating on the new process moving forward. Which one of them are up for re-election and which have turned out, and how will this collaborative effort continue into 2021? To my knowledge, I think Governor Inslee in Washington might be the only one up. Is Bullock up in Montana? Because I know that Governor Brown and Brad Little are not.
I think that Governor Bullock in Montana has term limited out and is actually running for senator.
That's right. So I knew he was running for something.
There is a gubernatorial shift that's going to occur in Montana, and we will wait to see, who's elected and what that's going to mean for this process moving forward. But our hope is that Montana sort of continues on the commitment that was expressed recently by Governor Bullock.
Yeah.
So all of the House people are up. Obviously, they're up every 2 years, and it's interesting because it's not just, it's not strictly a partisan issue. It is in some ways, but Mike Simpson, for example, in Idaho, is one of the first people who's questioned, whether those dams should still be there. And LeeAnne talked about how we're working on Derek Kilmer and some of the other representatives in the Northwest. So, and those people are accessible. I know my own congressperson and friend Denny Heck. The first time I ever talked to him about removing the dams on the Lower Snake, he pretty much thought I was crazy. But I think he's at least open to listening to the idea now. And I think the same is probably true of some others as well. And part of it is just because, as Joseph said, this is such the energy thing, among other things, is so dynamic. And the other thing is I think nobody should forget that we've already invested $17 billion on the Columbia Snake system to try to recover salmon, basically by kind of doing the same thing. And it's not working. So I think people are ready to maybe try something else.
And that actually is a nice segue to what might end up being our last question. I don't know how much more time we have, Joseph, but somebody in the chat or in the Q&A asked, what can they do as an average person to move this issue forward? And again, I would say if you're a person of faith, I would ask you to sign the salmon letter. I put it back in the chat for you. But reach out to your elected officials, no matter what. This is an issue that is going to require action and leadership from our governors, from our Northwest delegation. So if this is something that's important to you, send a message to Governor Inslee, send a message to your representative wherever you live in the state. I see we have some people from out of the state who are on here, including at least one person from Missoula, 2 people from Missoula. Contact your governor, contact your representative, contact your senators, because the more they hear from actual people just like you, just like me, just like all of us, they understand the depth and breadth of the passion that people have to see a Northwest that works for everybody. And there's a lot of noise out there right now. And we need to cut through and be the positive story that shows how folks can bridge divides, come together, and work together towards a common goal when the rest of the world is still stuck in divides. And so as someone in the faith community, that's what we try to do. We try to bring people together, but you don't have to be a person of faith to be able to speak your heart and speak your values and put your those values into action at the highest levels. So I encourage you to do so and vote. Always remember to vote.
Darcy Huffman added that one word suggestion.
Great. Thank you, Darcy.
3 exclamation marks, which is vote. That's something that's in front of all of us right now. John, any further thoughts before we conclude?
Well, yeah. I guess I'd say this. We're talking specifically about the Snake River dams, which is an important issue that we want to keep in front of people. But I guess I would also encourage people to, in their homes and in their congregations, to if you don't know your watershed already, figure out what it is. That if you've got a scout troop at your church, that's a good job for them. We did that at the last church I served. The scouts were all over that, and pay attention to the watershed that you're in, and pray for your watershed, the health of your watershed, and there's all sorts of allies out there who would welcome you as a person of faith, I think, to their cause. Groups like Save Our Wild Salmon and others. So there's plenty of allies out there. You don't have to feel like you have to do it all by yourself. So I guess that's where I would leave it.
Thanks, John. I want to close by just reiterating, echoing LeeAnne's advice. We live in a democracy, and it's so important for policymakers, and it makes a huge difference for policymakers to hear from people. And so, I bet LeeAnne's website has actions that people can take. The Wild Salmon website, wildsalmon.org. We have an alert page and a number of different actions that people can take right now, including links to phone numbers. And if you want to put a call in as well as sending an email and having a little more impact, probably, feel free to reach out to me or Carrie to find out how to get more involved. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website. We have an opportunity here, and there's tremendous urgency, and things are changing for the better. And I think that we all have a role to play in helping get the attention of our elected officials in the Northwest. Governors, members of Congress, I think, are really the top targets right now. So, feel free to follow up with us to learn how to get more involved or focus your activities. But LeeAnne and John, I want to thank you so much for this evening. It's just, I always just really relish our time together, and this evening was really special for me. So thank you for that. I want to thank everyone who's attending, and once again encourage you. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for the great questions. Oh, if your question, there's a few questions that didn't get answered, I would just encourage, Carrie or I are happy to follow up and talk with you. So don't hesitate to reach out if you've got questions and want to continue the conversation. With that, I think we'll adjourn. It's been a great evening. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph.